Welcome to UX and ATX. My name is Cindy Brummer. I am one of the organizers of this meetup group, joined here with Andrina Dyer and Yunji Zhang and Jessica Miller tonight. We're so glad that you're here for where UX and product management meets. UX and ATX, if you're new to our organization, we are all about building a community of UX designers, supporting UX practitioners at every stage in your career. And while we've started in Austin, our membership is across the world, honestly. You can find us all over the place. We are at uxandatx.com. We are on Meetup, LinkedIn, Facebook, and please, if you have not joined our Slack community, Andrina shared the link a little bit earlier. We'll keep sharing that tonight. Join us in our Slack community to stay in touch in between our meetups. We are looking for volunteers all the time. You can reach out. We are very open to bringing people in. There's a need for ambassadors in our Slack community, for folks to help us with graphic design. We're very fortunate to have some folks there keeping track of our meetups and helping us find speakers. Speaking of meetups and organizing that, our next meetup in July will be the 28th at 6:30 p.m. Central. We will have a group of engineers / developers joining us to talk to us about the best way to communicate with them so you can be successful in your projects. If you've ever either clashed with a developer or been intimidated by a developer or not sure how to even talk to one, this is your opportunity to ask them anything, and it will be a really great talk. All right, so getting back to tonight's topic, we are doing a little bit different. We've done a lot of panels lately. We're really excited tonight to do a series of short talks on where UX and product management meet. Our speakers this evening will be Pedro Duarte, Jacqueline Sigler, and Sudha Balan. They are all going to speak on various aspects of the intersection of user experience design and product management. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because our first speaker is going to be Pedro. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cindy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cindy.
Let you take it away.
I will now share my screen. Okay. So are you seeing the screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, good evening, everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about why product development needs to change with the times. This is my perspective and from my experience. But first, please let me introduce myself. I'm Pedro Duarte. I'm a designer from Lisbon, Portugal, here at Europe. I started my career as a designer a long time ago. Believe me, very long time ago. I crossed different areas of design, such as editorial, graphic, brand design. I had my time as well as a freelancer and did some design consultancy, and then became a web designer. We were in 2008, probably 2009, and on that time I had my first interaction of what UX design is. And to be honest, I quite felt that thing, that we want to do that for the rest of our lives at that time. And I felt that about UX. I was working in a startup. We were doing field studies, usability testing, a bunch of things that I truly loved. It was huge. Later, I also played the product owner role for several projects. And I liked a lot, to be honest, playing that role. I liked so much that I want to become a product manager. And I was product manager for 2 different companies for completely 2 different uh, products. But to be honest, I was missing design a lot. I was missing the design process. I was missing dealing with the ambiguity of the problems and for the solutions. And that was then when I joined Critical Software as a user experience designer, and then I got the change to embrace the role of head of user experience design. And here I am today. Today, essentially, I'm doing design ops and less work in the field as a UX designer. But yeah, that's life. Just to have a little bit more context about what we are doing at Critical Software. Critical Software work with critical mission systems, those systems that cannot afford to fail, which means that if some of these systems fail or the user use that system in the wrong way, something really bad can happen. And I'm talking about people's lives in danger or huge money lost by business, etc., etc. The industries we work with is about aerospace, aeronautics, defense, energy, finance, and so on. But yeah, so backing to the topic, why product development needs to change with the times, and generally because the way we ideate, the way we design and deliver products has changed over a short period of time. And briefly, just to tell you the story, because you guys also know the story. We started a long time ago with the typewriters trying to digitalize, let's say, the things, and then appeared the computers, and came up the democracy of the personal computers as well. At that time, the objectives and the needs of the user started to change, and markets and also companies had to adapt to those needs. Then when people start to use computers or know how to use computers, well, not in that case exactly, but the important here to retain is a technology that time was evolving day by day in a fast pace, and actually when we realized we were using mobile phones, and I remember so well when my dad had his first mobile phone, that it was very similar to this one actually. I was amazed how that small thing, and again, probably not so small, but how that thing can talk to another people from the other side of the world. So yeah, and again, objectives and needs from the user started again to change, and companies and markets had to adapt to it again. And then, came up the iPhone, and again, and smartphones started to impact our lives, and they still do. And we have started to use smartphones for almost everything, for daily banking, for reading the news, taking photos to social media, etc., etc. And again, our needs and objectives evolved once again. And with that, due to people's increasing digital literacy, people were now expecting that digital interfaces respond naturally to what they need and to what they want, because they they started to use digital apps every day, and they had that expectation. And was then we have started to notice that some companies started to seek for shorter, faster, and more effective deliveries in order to validate their ideas and their business assumptions, because that way they can receive and they can implement feedback rapidly to add value to their end users in a way to give them satisfaction of use of the digital products. That's when again we have started to talk about agile and agility. And at the beginning of the early 2000s, it was like, whoa, your company work in agile. Did you work with Jira? Wow, fantastic, and so on and so forth. But that's another topic, right? Because agile is not about the tools you use. Agile, it's a mindset that companies need for rapid growth, and these companies on the early 2000s that are popping up needed to have rapid growth in order to validate their ideas and then also make money with that, of course. And with agile, we have been heard about MVP, the term MVP. I'm pretty sure that you know what MVP means, but very briefly, minimum viable product. Actually, it was defined in 2001, and then it was popularized by Eric Rice in the Lean Startup book. That Bible that some of these companies that are popping up in the early 2000s follow. But MVP is a very short version of a product with just enough features in order to be usable by early users or customers, in order to provide feedback and implement that feedback in future development. The way is by focus on releasing an MVP, it means that developers potentially avoid unnecessary work on features that probably users do not need or whatever, you know. But in the reality, and mainly for the last couple of years, we have been observed different perspectives and definitions of what MVPs are. Depending on who you speak to, the term MVP has slightly different definitions in terms of scope, in terms of priority, usability, technology, and even value. Do we are giving value to business, or do we are giving value to users? And herein lies the problem, because and if you think in this case specifically, when we are talking to a customer about the strategy to follow is to have an MVP in 2 or 3 months to validate their business assumptions, for instance, or their business ideas. In our client minds, what they heard and what they want is to have a final product in 2 or 3 months, right? So and this is one of the things that are really that doesn't help to define the term MVP or the concept of MVP. And secondly, the term MVP also, or about the term MVP, there is a clash between developers and designers, because we have developers that tend to consider MVPs as rough prototypes, They want always to input less effort in everything, in every development. And on the other hand, we have us, designers, that always want to stick on usability standards and best practices, while prevent the art of Frankensteining. That art of Frankensteining that I call is that type of art that when the developer needs to come up with a specific interface without any help of the designer, because probably they will use the wrong component for that specific interaction, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the day, we will end up with a product that is kind of Frankenstein, and yeah, and that's why. And at the end of the day, again, we can say that MVP, in terms of this concept that we have been observed for the last few years, oversees the user dimension, because it removes important aspects of user experience, and mainly because they remove pleasure and simplicity of use. Actually, according to Forrester research report, 70% of the projects are unsuccessful because they lack user acceptance. And that's really bad, because if we do not have user acceptance, probably the product will fail. And those are the main reasons from my perspective. Of course, the product could fail because badly they completely misunderstood the user needs, or probably they went late to the market, because instead of launching an MVP in 2 or 3 months, they launch a full polished product in 12 months, and then it was late for the market. And last but not the least, due some technical failure, because and again, trying to prevent that type of art that I call Frankensteining, probably the interactions are wrong or the components that we are using are not the ones for that type specifically of interaction, and so on and so forth. And then yeah, probably they failed to some technical failure as well. But that's when we have started to think on this problem, and we have started to thinking there should be a way to provide value from the beginning, as the term MVP initial concept says, that we need to provide that value from the beginning, but also to connect emotionally to the users, right? So and if you can, and if we can do it, probably we will increase the user acceptance rate, and that will be great for our product. That's when a bunch of product managers is essentially started to talk about MLPs. MLPs, or minimum level products, its objective is to earn users' love since the very first release. Of course, we want a product that is viable, that is delightful and remarkable. But that this term MLP, at the first time that I heard about it was in the Lovability book of Brian DeHuff in 2017. Truly recommend this book if you didn't read yet. But yeah, I remember so well that makes all the sense for the problems that we are facing with that time, and yeah, and that's make all the sense for us. And in practice, because you probably are now thinking, what are the main changes regarding MVP and MLP? In practice, implementing an MLP is very similar to MVP, right? So we just need to change the focus directly to the end users. We need to focus on the why and validate the business assumptions and try to understand what users really like and what users really love, in order to build something with a purpose, and not only to build something that some stakeholder wants or needs or thinks that is the best. We need to stay lean and agile, because the M in MLP is exactly the same that stands for the MVP, and it's minimum. But the focus is to delighting users, but also to be agile, and seek for feedback. Seek for qualitative feedback, and take decisions with this in mind, because the goal is to address rapidly user experience gaps. So in that way, we can follow the user livability. And again, this is not, we are working in agile. This is not the final version of the product. We need to test, iterate, and repeat a bunch of times. It's key. And visually, let's say that on the other hand, we have the business requirements, technology, competitors, perfectionism, and that future needs that the business always want to have into the first release. And on the other hand, we have the user needs, and we have still to focus on the user needs. And we can say that, or I can say that, the best strategy to deliver user values delightfully, of course, is to prioritize the end user experience, and not the technology, or not the business requirements, or the competitors, because my competitor have this specific feature, I need to have as well. So no, we need to stick on the user needs and to prioritize that. This image, actually, I liked a lot this image, because from my perspective, it clears explain what is MVP and MLP. So and if you think which one creates a memorable experience, you know. So on the left side, we have a big raw chocolate cake with a bunch of features. They probably are not so simple to use, but we have them all. And on the other hand, we have the MLP, where we have 10 times smaller, probably, slice of the same chocolate cake, but to a better standard, you know. And you can, when we focus on a small thing, we can consider a layer of business, we can consider a layer of technology, usability, livability, and so on and so forth. So the main idea is, when we are developing an MLP, we don't need to bake the whole cake at once, let's say. And again, and if you think the time and effort of developing a series of functionalities like the big raw chocolate cake are exactly the same when we limit important features that to develop or that trigger that positive emotional responses, you know, from the users, and that's when it's so important to prioritize those features in order to make a good MLP. Talking about prioritization, so it's very important, as I said, to prioritize the features. Actually, there are too many prioritization methods from out there. There's no one method is better than another, to be honest. It depends from your project context, your team also, and so on. So use the one that to the best works for you. But from my perspective and from my experience building MLPs, the best model to prioritize MLPs is the Kano model. Kano model is a framework that was designed by Dr. Noriaki Kano, a professor of quality management in 84, and at the end of the day analyzes and ranks the features or ideas according to a single consideration, which is how much each feature is likely to delight users. You know, so I will not talk you about how to use Kano model, because that specifically is another session that you can have afterwards, of course. But basically, Kano model items are grouped into 4 categories according to user satisfaction and functionality. And at the end of the day, we'll have the more attractive ideas or the more attractive features that exactly delight users, and that are the ones that we want to put into MLP. And because MLP, of course, is not the final product, remember, it's important to keep evolving the product. And when developing that, we need to go by vertical slices instead of horizontal. This means that in each release of the product, in each development, we need to include elements of every level. We need to put the level of function or reliable, usable, and also lovable. Almost finishing, and this is a very good sentence, actually, because it remembers a thing that once someone told me, and that I keep that in my mind. So it's better to have 100 users love you than 1 million kind of like you, you know. And we can say that the product that is deeply loved is one that can scale. So yeah, that's my final words for you regarding the products being loved from my perspective and from my experience, by having products that users really love. But that's the true scale of products. Want to finish giving a special thanks to Eduardo, my dear friend. Eduardo is agility director at Critical Software also, and he helped me to build some of the content regarding the agile tips. So thank you, Eduardo, and yeah, I thank you. Hope you enjoyed.
That was awesome, Pedro. I loved that. I'm gonna make a call for any questions in the chat. Just give people like a couple seconds to get those in. I had never heard the term minimum lovable product before, so this was really enlightening for me. I'm curious if you like after the when the next talk, would you mind sharing the book title that you mentioned, that 2017 book? That would be really helpful
Yeah,
for
sure.
us.
Yeah, sure.
There is a
Yeah,
question.
I'll put that in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a question. What are your sustainability methods for MLP?
Whoa, very good question. I do think sustainability is from my understanding, sustainability, it really are the user needs. It really is keeping investing in discovering, in research, is keeping to trying to to find the user experience gaps on the products we design, because that way we can go to the stakeholders, we can go to our customers and say, so we discovered these gaps, so we need quickly to fix this in order to keep the product evolving yet to the same way. Yeah, and if you think, we have actually a bunch of examples that work that way. We can remember Facebook, we can remember, we have Twitter and so on and so forth. They started one of the focus they have in the initial product was exactly that. It was finding the user experience gaps and try to fix it as up, in order to keep the lovable to be loved, let's say.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pedro. We'll make time at the end for questions for everyone. In the meantime, sure. Jacqueline, are you here? I see. Hey, Jacqueline. There you are. Okay, cool.
Hi.
I'm going to make you a co-host so that you can share your screen.
I had switched to my phone because I'm staying at a friend's apartment in New York City, and I forgot that people who work in finance, which I used to, they do not use Macs. They all use PCs. So I thought I was coming in with a charger, no problem. And so anyway, I'm gonna switch over so I can be in present mode. So I'm just going to rejoin the Zoom. So if you just bear with me one moment, I'll get that set up.
No problem. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and introduce you. So Jacqueline is a senior product manager with over 4 years of experience in product management and 9 years prior experience in the financial services industry, as she just mentioned, in corporate strategy and mergers, acquisitions. She mentioned earlier she was based in, or she is based in Austin, visiting New York right now. Austin has been her home for 5 years, and she previously lived and worked in both New York and London. Jacqueline has been a product manager at GoDaddy for 2.5 years, focused on its digital marketing software and services products, desktop and mobile web-based. She has her MBA from the University of Texas McCombs in entrepreneurship and a BA from Lafayette College in economics and business. Outside of work, Jacqueline enjoys Austin's hikes, eccentric coffee shops, and local businesses, as well as reading both online and hard copies, and is a self-professed Bravo aficionado. Let me make sure I have you, the right person who is ready to share your screen. All right, you should be able to share now.
Yes, I see that. Thank you very much.
And the
Thank
floor
you
is
for
yours.
the intro, Cindy. And it's yes, yay books. I've really in the last this year really gone back into reading books, and I just really like true wisdom lies in books, and especially I love, as mentioned, I love reading hard copy books and you know, a non-digital format. And previously, I would say that Bravo used to be considered a guilty pleasure, but I genuinely don't think there's anything to feel guilty about. So if anyone here likes Bravo, you have a fellow fan here. Okay, so Pedro, those slides were absolutely wonderful. You are the UX designer. I am the product manager, so naturally mine are going to be a bit more logical, problem oriented. And I'm actually going to borrow some slides from a recent training that I did with, you can see the brand here, it's called Pragmatic Institute. And they are a very well-known course, certification course, particularly for those in the product building world. Now that encompasses PMs, but also UX designers, engineers, product marketers, as well as they have different tracks than then for people who are in marketing traditionally, meaning, you know, marketing organization, as well as data science. So I recently did their training, and I thought that I would borrow some of their material. And some of these things this training was geared towards product managers, but with that said, I think that the relationship between, well, first taking a step back, I think the product building, creating process, I view it really, it's a three-way street between UX, and I think UX is really kind of like the starting point along with PM, but UX leading. Product is going to be like the whole way through, but the engineers are ultimately what make it happen, you know. And it's like, it's such an amazing process every time when you're working as a team, and particularly product and UX on the front half, coming up with the designs, and then, you know, the engineers, you know, through deep evaluation of how to approach, you know, they build it, and then you start looking at the test, and you're just like, whoa, this looks like the designs. It feels like magic sometimes, but anyway, it's fun. Okay, so one of the things that this course emphasized was that an outside-in approach increases the likelihood of product success. And product meaning, in this case, it's not product like you're a product person, it means the product success. And what this specifically is talking about is, I know, I think a good amount of folks are earlier in their UX stages, but let's say for folks like myself, especially when you've been working at the same company or working with the same customer group for a long time, there can be like a natural tendency to like think that you know what the problems are. But really at the end of the day, it's like you need to go out, talk to the users, get the sense of their day in the life, figure out where their stressors, their pain points are. And it's really more of like a problem seeking approach versus like, we know the problems, let's go solve them type of a thing. And what they're talking about then in this structure is, what this is referencing is that in marketing, there's something that's often referred to as the 4 Ps, which are those that you see at the top. And it says the missing P is the problem, and particularly for the product manager, but let's say also, I think for the UX person, you need to always be coming back to like, what is the user and the customer problem that we're solving for, to ensure that that you're going to deliver the outcome, and the outcome meaning like you're going to help assuage that user's struggle. So that's like the point of emphasis, and ignoring like what this framework and all the thing is, because there's a lot in here, and the good and the bad is these are all the different things that go into building products. But I think I don't know if you can you see my scroll? my mouse. Okay, great. So I think I'm going to take a step back from what these slides say and just as a preface, because I think a lot about, I think there's the why, there's the what, and the how in terms of the building product and the whole process. And I think that the why, meaning why are we doing something? Why do we have this problem? That is really UX driven. And then that problem seeking mindset with partnership with product managers, and the PM is they're helping to define what's the product problem definition, but they're also going to be, myself, like very much focused on like why we're doing the thing and what's the broader solution, what's the plan, what's the timeline, who's the customer base, what type of release plan. These are all kind of like the what details. And then the engineers are the how. They're the how it makes it happen. And so to speak to a couple of the different things that we see on the screen specifically, there's a buyer persona, the user persona, and an example of this would be, I have one, but it's escaping me at the moment. Well, actually, I have a good one. So let's say that I run a coffee shop. I'm the owner of the coffee shop, and I employ different clerks to work at the coffee shop. So like, I, as the owner of the business, I might decide we're going to buy this point of sale, this register, and we're going to do it this way. And so as let's say then switching hats, I'm GoDaddy trying to sell to that buyer. You're then positioning like why this would be a value for them, what the merchant or the store owner cares about. Whereas the clerks, they're the ones actually using the thing day to day. And so those are different. And I think that the UX team plays a meaningful role in terms of identifying who is the user that we're targeting, what is their day in the life, and does it distinct between the buyer and user. Going to, I think, let's see. We can talk about this, and then I'm gonna, unfortunately, I don't have as many prepared slides, but so it's gonna be a little bit more freeform. But in terms of that large spectrum that you saw in terms of the whole product building process, where it starts early, and when it's talking about this win-loss analysis, this competitive landscape, this is really at the like product marketing level, where we might say, what's GoDaddy's larger strategy? What are the messages that resonate in the market? What are competitors doing? And so we start with like, that's an overall positioning of where does GoDaddy want to head, and therefore where does GoDaddy want to head, but also where is the industry heading? So we know through the pandemic that e-commerce is just exponential. And so doing this assessment is all kind of driving towards that. And then, this aspect of the business side, this is an interaction between product marketing, a little bit less, I would say, of a UX focus. But then when we get into this, like I mentioned, we have this buyer persona, the user persona. That's definitely going to be a UX portion. The planning side requirements, that's actually kind of see it like three ways, because the UX team are putting the designs together to help realize the vision, and engineers cannot do anything without the designs. And there's not engineers in the room, so I'll say that like very unequivocally. It's really a true partnership. And then product is, then playing a role as far as thinking through, we have these customers' problem we want to solve. We also want to get these, let's say, new features out by a certain roadmap timeframe. Engineers are going to say it's going to take, one more month than we thought it was going to take to actually build, which is usually what happens. And so then the PM is like kind of making then the adjustments of what is Pedro was alluding to, these like kind of the first order of getting to that lovable product. The product person is often playing the role of like, how can we refine this and then scale over time and iterate over time. I'm going to skip over these last different parts, but this is the last like three, I would say, are in the like, then when you go into the launch phase, this is like the training. What are we talking about in the marketing? if you have a sales team who's actually selling, what does that all look like? And there's also a support element too. So as you can see, there's really a whole slew of responsibilities that go into the product building, selling, launching process. But ultimately coming back to here and a bit where I started is this, going back to the problems. It says product team, but again, this is really, I would say, product and UX. So as an example, I've been working for the last 2-3 months on, we recently launched a marketing service offering, which means that we do, for GoDaddy's customers, the customer will pay several $100s a month, and then with the expectation that we will actually then do all their marketing for them. And now that we've launched those services, the next phase of it is actually having metrics that convey that, with the service, we've increased your revenue, traffic to your website, social impressions, visits to your social page, followers, sort of all of those things. And so when we started thinking about, and I say we, particularly my product and UX, as far as it's the first phase of so these customers, why do they care to see their metrics? And oftentimes, like, they want to just spend their time running their business, but if they're going to be paying several $100s a month, like, they need to know that it's translating in terms of return on investment. And also, the businesses want to grow, they want to get new customers. So even though some of those things may sound obvious, like going through the phase of like the why does this matter? Like, why are customers looking at their metrics? What type of metrics do they care about? Do they care about metrics just like do they check it every 90 days? Do they want to check it daily? Do they want to see like advanced charts? All these like kind of like why questions are really a lot of this customer discovery phase that is a joint partnership between UX and product. And I would say what happens from there is then often the product person will then get into more specifics of like this is going to be this is what we're going to what we want to be solving for. Here's our objectives, here's our approach. And then it's really then UX who's realizing that vision, i.e. through the designs, to serve that need, and to either, in the case of GoDaddy, we have a different existing UX patterns that we might adapt to, or like in this case, we do have those UX patterns, but we also did a series of competitor research, understanding what do similar providers, how do they show their metrics, the format, all of those different things. And then when we talk about moving over to solutions, this is really when it says the development, this is when it's going to the actual coding, making of the thing to then realize. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So sorry, you're just going to be looking at my face. But I wanted to give some examples of how I've worked with UX and some things that I would say we've how the UX relationship has evolved. And I know that for many of you, likely your experience is that not only just company to company does perhaps like the agile scrum or the squad of the PM, the UX and engineer, that might look different company to company. It also can look different team to team. So for example, one of the teams that I is one of our teams that's adjacent product. Their UX designer is in every single one of their stand-ups. They go to their team meetings. They're in, they're kind of even sometimes I think in the sizing, they're hearing what's the priorities, things of that nature. And so they're, sort of like a true knit combo, if you will. Whereas like when I had started, we did not have UX in any of those sessions really. And it was a lot of product person talking to UX, product talking to engineering, but like still collaborating. But even as I just described it, you could see how things could get lost in the cracks. So we would have sessions, we meaning product and design, where we'd review the designs with engineering, we'd review the requirements. But because we weren't meeting regularly, there would be occasions where like engineering would show what they've built, and we'd be like, what is this? Like, this doesn't match the design. And then, you know, not only is it a little bit of a friction, but then you have to redo work, and no one likes to redo work. And one of the other challenges that I've encountered, and our team, broadly speaking, has encountered is, especially if you're dealing with let's say, an application that has multiple components, has a desktop component, has a mobile component. Let's say a product person comes in and says, we can't build this anymore, it's taking too long, cut this from MVP scope. And then we say, okay, like, here's the main design where that's cut. But then we use Figma, like, then you have these other different screens that change hasn't flown through. And then engineers are still working with those not since amended designs. So those are something like that was a case that had actually happened on numerous occasions. And I would say, so we had some honest conversations after that. And, you know, there's certainly no malintent. It's just, you know, engineers want to do things their way. UX is, you know, they've made their changes, products kind of looking and saying, like, what is happening? So what we have since adapted to a model is that we have our designer come to like select few stand-ups, and it's kind of like an optional if they want to attend the stand-ups, and that they will attend our regular week. We have a 1 weekly session where it's product, UX, and engineering. It's expected, like, all three are expected to participate, to do design reviews, to talk through questions about the designs and the like. And that's definitely improved the overall team unity, I would say, and just connectivity. One of the other things that I found when I was talking before, how there was more of like the product to UX dialogue and then the product to engineering dialogue. What I found was that the engineers, like, weren't talking to the UX designers as much. They were like trying to figure things out amongst themselves, or like sometimes that they would ping the designer, but they were like sitting in DM, so lacking any visibility to the rest of the team. And so we also have since adapted and said that this is very much like Slack world, but basically anytime we're talking about questions or on the designs or questions from product or engineering is not sure, is this the latest? We said, put it in our team Slack channel. Like, don't do DMs, because this is how some things get lost in translation. What else? I kind of want to shift gears a little bit, but one of the other things that I was going to mention, what I wanted to mention, is that I was also finding in some of that previous arrangement that engineers were coming to me all the time to ask questions. And like, you want to facilitate more of like a cohesive team unit. And so I encourage engineering and design to start, you know, speaking to each other more, ask questions more, but again, do it in a form that it's all visible so that the team all has the same information. Shifting gears a little bit, how am I doing on time, Cindy?
Yeah, pretty good. Probably want to wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so.
Okay, sure. So I'm going to shift a little bit, and I just want to give some examples of different things that I've done with particularly with design. So last year we launched a brand new product experience, or product capability, if you will, and it is a brand related, not brand new, like an actual brand related application. And what that meant is, as part of this marketing service, we design a business's brand for them. So we're designing their colors, their voice and tone, their website description, example social post, their logo, such that this is meant to convey your business identity through digital marketing, through all the online presence. And so there was a sort of an understanding of why did we want to approach this, or why was there a need? And that's because for the customer, as part of the service, we want to ensure that we're both up-leveling their brand, but also before we do any marketing content for the customer, that we're really going to be speaking in the way that they want to, presenting themselves the way that they want to be presented. And so we did a series of different discovery sessions. There was an old, like very outdated, very static experience prior. And so as we started developing designs, we put a prototype together and actually engaged different customers who had previously experienced that brand in that static format, and then put their brand in this new format, and asked them to go through prototypes. And then we did live customer interviews for their feedback. And we made the questions both qualitative in nature as well as quantitative, as far as like if you were going to give this overall brand, what we call brand guide, a score of 1 to 5, how would you score it, so that you're gaining some sense of, are we actually improving beyond the qualitative? And then we also did a series of user testing, and that was really in terms of to gauge interpretability, to gauge usability, to also understand if like the perception, like, is this useful? Would you use this on your website? Also, what's it called? Like, we actually then did a discovery around the name of the product. And so we asked users on the usertesting.com we didn't give them a name, and they said, like, how would you refer to this? And why would you refer to it this way? But what's really great about the usertesting.com is that you're seeing the user click through a prototype. And what gets lost when you're doing the product and design building is you're seeing that design every single day. Whereas someone that new is coming in and we think something's intuitive, and we hear them saying, like, I don't know where to click. And what else did we do? We did do then a subsequent naming study, which was fun to come up with a name. And then finally, actually for that, we did an internal survey and asked people, we solicited people's names after we had recorded a video of the prototype. So it was kind of fun. And then finally, we released a sort of beta version, if you will, to a set of customers to start getting feedback for them before we built it live. And all of that was a very, very heavy product UX partnership throughout that discovery validation phase, through the customer interviews, through the user testing. And so I've always enjoyed it. I think every time I work with design, I always learn immensely, and particularly like good at ensuring that we're not making too many sacrifices to the point that this is no longer like a delightful experience, or like we've lost sight on like the problem that we're trying to solve.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Sure.
I know that there was a question in the chat. I do want to make sure that we move on to Sudha just to make sure. So we might circle back to that, but feel free to answer that in the chat if you do need to take off early, because I know that you're traveling and all that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, now for our final speaker, Sudha Balan. Sudha is a Dallas area-based senior product manager. She currently leads home buyer customer growth at Redfin. Her 13-year career includes over 9 years of managing digital products across real estate, hospitality, and life sciences. Sudha lives in the Dallas area with her family and loves traveling, movie marathons, painting, and DIY projects. I'm very excited to have Sudha speak with us tonight. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Cindy. This is my first time talking here, and I'm super excited. It's going to be a tough act to follow. Pedro and Jacqueline did a great job of looking at things from a product and a UX perspective. So hopefully I can try to find a middle ground there. So most of my talk is going to be centered around the metrics versus the outcomes approach, and how even the notion of value can change when product is working alone or when UX is working alone versus when they collaborate. um, and a lot of this, like, I've seen it in action in my career, and so just being more intentional about it has helped my team even change what we define as a great product. um, so this is one of my favorite quotes. What this actually talks about is customer obsession. And I think that is one thing that can only come when product and UX are tight collaboration with each other. So one thing that I've, over the last few years, tried to ground myself and my team over again on is that products drive outcomes, not metrics. And this is a really fine line, but an important line for both the products and the UX, people on the team to understand. Um, a metrics-driven mindset focused on whether you're moving a number, and usually it's around business value. Like, are we moving revenue? Are we moving like a particular strategic goal in the right direction and stuff like that? And this is usually the default mindset that product can take when working on its own. And then there is this other approach, which is more outcome driven, which is your focus is more on addressing a user need or point. And the result of this would be that you would ultimately end up moving a metric, but the metric itself, the way you define it and the way you move it, your approach is going to be entirely different. There is a great example. Like, I was reading a case study a while ago, and one of the examples that stood out in this realm is Wells Fargo. A few years ago, Wells Fargo had this strategy around cross sell. And the way they decided to approach the strategy was a very metrics driven approach, where they just ended up opening accounts for some of their customers to drive their cross sell goals, but the customers didn't even know that accounts were being created for them. In the end, when you look at the result, the metric moved great, but Wells Fargo lost millions of dollars. In a class action lawsuit, it lost the trust of its customers. There was a pretty drastic drop in both credit card and checking account, adoption for them, which was the exact reverse of what they wanted to achieve. And the reason they landed in that place is their focus all along was, are we moving this cross sell number? Now, if they had taken an outcome driven approach to the same situation, their approach would have been more along the lines of, first of all, even product and UX collaborating to ask if cross sell is the right thing to be working on. And if it is, then what is the best way for us to understand user pain points and understand, user needs, and figure out what behaviors we need to encourage among users to help us achieve, said cross-sell goal. And even their notion of what success is in the space would have changed had it been an outcome-driven approach. So this is something that I personally, as a product manager, keep an eye on to make sure that we are not over-indexing on metrics, but we're talking about outcomes, and the only way I can get there is with a strong partnership with my UX peers. And when you start digging a little bit deeper into outcomes, there's two key things that ladder up to a good outcome. One of it is value, and one of it is usability. All through these sessions, we saw a lot of flavors of this, but this is my way of defining what value means, which is, are we solving the right problem? Is there even value in solving it? Is there value for the user, and hence is there value for the business in solving this? And that is value. And usability is more about, are we solving it right? Which means, are we building intuitive solutions to real user problems? Do we have an in-depth understanding of who the user is? And are our solutions actually in a way that users find it intuitive and easy? And both of these need to come together to drive an outcome. You might find a super valuable problem, but if you're not able to come up with a usable solution, it's not going to take off. It goes back to the concept of minimum lovable product. So you need to make sure that you're solving a problem that users care about, but also solving it in a way that users care about. And the same is true for usability too. If you over-index on usability, where you're building a solution that looks cool, it's super easy to use, but it really doesn't address a need or a want that users care about, then that solution's not going to take off either. And so these two need to come together to achieve outcomes. And again, the only way these can come together is when product and UX collaborate. And so value and usability are things. And one practical way in which I've been able to put this to use is literally start rating solutions and problems. So this is a framework that I use with my team while prioritizing. Um, One of the things we do is when we talk about, hey, here are 15 different problems that you could solve for users, and here are some ways in which you could solve it. Literally start to plot them on a 4x4. Like you have value on one side, you have usability on the other side, on a 2x2 grid, and you start plotting these solutions and problems along that grid, and it helps you get to what should be the thing you start off with a little bit faster. So this is when you start to think about value and usability. Traditionally, these were two areas that one product focused on entirely, which is value, and the second, usability, is something that UX focused on entirely. Today, these roles are evolving and there is a lot more overlap. And I really like this visual because it gives you a really good sense for how this overlap even happens. So in some of the teams that I worked in earlier on in my career, the overlap would only happen when it came to defining the use cases and when it came to doing some research on these users. So that was the only point of interaction between product and UX. So there were a lot of handoffs. Product would do its thing, UX would do its thing, and then they would pretty much operate in silos, and then they would hand things over back and forth. But this approach is not going to work today. For us to delight our users, we need a pretty solid understanding of every step of their journey. And the only way you can get there is by making sure we collaborate more. And so the points at which the product and the UX world start blending together are around KPIs and metrics. So historically, this is an area that product cares about more. But in order for us to be more successful these days, that is also a conversation that product and UX need to have together to figure out what is it that we need to measure, and also be part of measuring it together, calibrating against this definition of success. And I think that leads to a lot of creativity and innovation. And so highly recommend that if you haven't tried that, that is something that would be like the first point of partnership is, hey, how do we define success? Let's do it together. And then on the UX side, historically, a lot of the UI design, usability testing, prototyping, all of this has been something that we've always looked to UX to sort of own. But this is also an area where collaboration can take you further. Is having brainstorming sessions together, for example, to figure out ways in which you could solve the problem, or coming up with prototyping candidates is a great way to build on that partnership. And so when it comes to this overlap or this partnership between product and UX, it translates into product development. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, where when you look at good product development, what it really needs is collaboration between product and UX, not handoffs. So you don't want this thing where you have one phase in the process, for example, discovery, right? Like understanding the user problem. Historically, this would be something where product would go, well, I'm going to do it. And then UX, I'll tell you, what you need to design or what problem I discovered, so you can go about designing it. This approach is very siloed, and it is not going to get you to outcomes. What is going to get you to outcomes is a pretty solid partnership, but with an understanding of what our partnership looks like, and also who owns it versus who is sort of part of the solution. So this is a standard product development life cycle. So you have discover, design, test, measure, and scale. And so being intentional about, hey, we are in this phase of the product development process. is also a great way for you to understand how the partnership should flow. Discovery, for example, it's all about understanding the user problem. So this would be a space where both product and UX can collaborate equally. Product can focus on figuring out the problems, for example, with a lot of partnership from the UX, and then UX can also help with like the notion of defining valuable problems, and how we go about measuring success. So that would be one way in which that collaboration can happen. And then when you look at design, which is all about finding solutions to the user problem, this would be a space in which there is maybe a lot more UX ownership here, but you definitely need to make sure product is part of this by brainstorming and prototyping together. Test is another one where historically it's been, hey, product, figure out how we're going to validate the solution and if the solution is the right one and if we want to proceed further. And so this is another place where product and UX can start collaborating a little bit more, because you could do a lot of things like usability testing and rapid learning cycles, building rapid learning cycles so that you actually talk to users about the solutions before investing in them wholeheartedly. And then the next step is measuring. So this step centers around, are we successful? Determining outcomes and determining impact. And then this is another phase where historically it's been, hey, product, figure it out, and hand off the results to the UX team. But this is another space where you can have a pretty strong collaboration to even interpret what success is. A lot of times we only focus on metrics that are moving or not moving, but this is also an opportunity for us to get a little bit more qualitative in our insights. How are users feeling? How are they interacting? How is the user experience? And making that part of your definition of success and also measuring and doing it together is a great way to ensure that you're on the right track to achieving outcomes. And then the final step, scale, which is it depends. Like in some organizations that I've worked at, this has been a pretty big deal where you test a concept among a small set of users, it takes off, but now you have to figure out how to scale it in multiple geographies, among multiple demographics and stuff like that. And this is another place where it has always been looked at as a very execution heavy space, but this is also another space where there can be a pretty strong partnership between product and UX, where things that we did for a subset of users, we need to make sure that they scale well when you're talking about multiple geographies, and if there are any considerations to user needs, and if that fundamentally changes the solution, then that needs to be done at this phase versus launching it and then realizing, oh, we should have actually thought about this a little bit more. And then when we talk about collaboration across the board with product development, the product development process, it really starts with having a shared understanding of the goal and coming up with a framework for seamless communication all through the product development process. So these are some things that have helped me have a good working relationship with my UX partners, and for them to also feel like they are equal partners, in the work that we're doing. One is need to start by a shared vision and clear goals. This is something that it seems like an obvious thing, but it's also a step that I've personally earlier on in my career often missed, and directly started to jump into the solution and problem definition, and coming up with a shared vision and clear goals can definitely add a little bit more clarity to that process. The second step is defining success metrics early and calibrating often if your understanding of success is still correct. A lot of times we define the success metrics and then we're like, that's what we're going to measure. But even the understanding of the metric evolves as you go through your discovery process and as you go through your design process, because you could start to get more understanding of the user behavior and go, hey, that thing we said we should measure, actually it's the other thing that makes more sense, because now we understand that happy users behave this way versus the other way that we originally defined. So this is another space where product and UX collaboration can happen, and can really drastically alter the course that your team's going to take. And then the third one is establishing ongoing feedback loops, whether it's product giving feedback to design or design giving feedback to product. It shouldn't be an environment like in an environment where you have handoffs. the notion of feedback also becomes very formal. You don't want something like that. So having things like, even daily sprints. One of the things we did at Hilton, where I worked a few years ago, is having shared stand-ups every day. Traditionally, stand-ups are something that your engineering team would have, and then the product manager would go in, and you're basically taking a very execution oriented mindset where you're trying to resolve blockers and stuff and launching things. But if you expand that a little bit and you start having your UX partners in the conversation, it becomes really holistic. It starts this really nice dialogue even between engineering and design. And not only are you now starting to look at value and usability, you're also starting to take a feasibility angle to things. And so that actually made the that actually was really essential to even team bonding, where everybody knew everybody, and design knew engineering. We all knew what we were working on, and we all felt like we had control over defining and achieving the outcomes. So sprints are a great way to start communicating seamlessly, and also providing in the moment feedback. And the fourth one is around decision making. You want to, with a strong partnership also comes a lot of overlap and kind of stepping on each other. So before you embark on solving a big problem, it makes sense to sit down and go, hey, here are some of the decisions that might need to be made, or usually typically people make, let's say in the discovery and the design phase, and starting to really call out who owns what, and making sure that there is um, controls that you put in place to sort of consult during the decision. So you also want to stay true to the agile nature of things. Like, you don't want to slow things down to a point that all you're doing is building consensus. So a really great way to achieve speed while making sure that you factor in both the product and UX perspective is coming up with a pretty healthy decision making framework really early on when you start collaborating. And historically, like, the way this has been done is product owns why and UX owns how, and this might mean different things in different contexts, but really starting to look at the types of decisions and what is centered around why versus what is centered around how is a great way to be more specific about who's doing what. In the spirit of starting your partnership journey with clear vision and goals, this is a framework that I've personally found to be incredibly useful. And the beauty of this is it needs product and UX partnership to actually come up with a crisp statement like this. So really what you want to do is you want to start off with the vision, like, what are we trying to achieve here? And then you want to start really defining who your target users are, and then what problem you're trying to solve, and then how you're going to solve it, which is the strategy. And then what would it mean when you actually achieve success? So that's the goal. Like, you will know that your product works when you see XYZ behaviors. So this is a great framework that I've used in every context, and it's amazing because this requires the entire team to collaborate, and you want to make sure that the entire team is comfortable with this, that everybody understands it and everybody embraces it. So this would be a really great exercise for both the product and the UX people on the team to sit down and hash it out together. And then finally, some of the benefits to a great product and UX partnership is that, first of all, this is the only way that you can consistently achieve success. I firmly believe in that. Um, but really, like, the benefits that this has is that you can always ensure that you're working on real valuable problems, and you can ensure that you are measuring success through outcomes and not metrics only, which is something we talked about. And then the biggest benefit for me is how quickly it helps you iterate and learn, but also at a super low cost. So doing things like usability testing and stuff like that versus just always leaning on, hey, I'm going to set it up as an A/B test. Sometimes an A/B test could be a faster way to learn, but sometimes you could just do some usability testing, and having that rapport with your design partner is going to help you figure out what's the fastest way that we can learn whether or not this is a usable way that we've solved the problem. And then the last one is around innovation blind spots. So this is another one which I think you can only achieve when you're working in partnership. Sometimes the most obvious ways to innovate, they completely get missed because people are looking at problems entirely differently versus looking at them together. So just make sure that as you're collaborating and walking through solutions, just because something is simple, you don't walk away, and having a design partner in the room will often ground those conversations on trying to find the right way to innovate, and also not innovating for the sake of innovating, but really making sure that you're solving a user problem through that. So in the end, ultimately, product and UX, when they partner together, they can create extremely happy users. And that is what I've found everywhere that I've worked, is the handoff approach and working in silos, and focusing on why and how separately, always leads to a lot of confusion, and it leads to a very um, you know unidirectional approach where you're trying to move a number. But in the end, if you start to focus more on outcomes and start to really collaborate to build a good understanding of your users and define success, it can lead to some very, very happy users.
I was just making sure you didn't have a final slide there, Sudha.
I'm good. I'm ready to take questions.
All right. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or we're a small enough group now where feel free to come off mute and ask. That was great. I really loved, first of all, each one of you had a different, kind of perspective on it, but they all so came together in so many good ways that I got a lot from all three of the presentations, especially this one. Anybody have any questions in the chat? Coming off mute. Can we all give huge round of applause, snaps and claps for our three speakers tonight? I know Jacqueline had to leave, but that was really, really cool. Thank you so much for your knowledge and perspective on product management and UX. All right, anyone have any final thoughts? Well, this has been a really great meetup. I'm happy to stay for a couple minutes if anybody has any lingering questions, but in the meantime, thank you for coming, and we'll see you in July for our next meetup. And see you on Slack. Have a good night, everyone.